What's up everybody, Alex here again. As you can see behind me, I painted my Integra. No, I'm just kidding. Pretty sure his alternator took a crap on him. It's not charging at all. I'll do a little bit of diagnosis, make sure that's it, but today we're going to be replacing the alternator on this thing for him. So I'm going to go ahead and get into it. Alright, we're just going to go ahead and check the battery real quick to see if the alternator's charging. Got my voltmeter here. Obviously I touched the two posts and we're only getting 11.8 volts. This thing should be at least charging at 13. So obviously our alternator's not charging. Now I just got to figure out if it's the alternator that's bad or if we're missing like some sort of signal to the alternator. So that's what I'll be doing next. Alright, we got the same thing here. If I touch my wire, I'm touching the big wire off of the alternator. I don't know if you can really see it. I got my ground here on the motor. Still 11.8 volts right at the alternator. So we know the alternator is not putting out to the battery. So now I got to check on the green plug-in and make sure we have all of our power and grounds on there. Okay, this is going to be hard to show on the vehicle while I'm trying to test it. I don't have nobody hold the camera. But I got our scan tool here for the shop. And I have some the component information for the alternator for this vehicle pulled up. It gives me a nice little wire number for the harness connector and tells me what each wire color is and what it's supposed to do. So basically the main thing I'm looking for is number 1 pin, which is this one, and it tells me that the view is from the harness side. If I was back probing that connector, that this would be the wire numbers from the harness side, so not from the alternator where it plugs into the alternator, but from the back side of it where it's from the harness. So that would be number 1. And basically the main thing I'm going to be looking for is the number 1 wire, which is ignition voltage. So if I turn the key on, it's a black and yellow wire. That wire should have ignition voltage on it, so it should have 12 volts on this ignition voltage wire. So that's what I'm going to check next, and I'll let you guys know my findings. All right guys, I hope I'm reading this right, otherwise I'll be chasing my tail all around this car. But I did just check, had the key in the on position, and I was checking my green connector off the alternator, my black yellow wire, which on the connector would be from this angle, it would be this right side. On the top right is my black yellow. I stuck a little like wire in there and had my I tried multiple different grounds to make sure I didn't have a bad ground, but I checked ground here. I actually even checked the battery ground, which should be good. I checked a couple other places and I was only getting like a volt on that wire. That should be ignition voltage, which means a full 12 volts. That wire should have 12 volts on it. So if I'm only getting 1 volt, that's not going to be telling the alternator to charge. That's correct, and I was getting good connection, and that's a proper reading, because if it is, that's where we need to start going first before I just slap an alternator on here, because putting an alternator on is not going to help if it's not being told to start charging. So I've got to find the source of this 12 volts. So I'm going to find fuse number 15, which is a 7.5 amp, or at least that's what should be in there unless somebody swapped it out, and then we'll see what it looks like. This is under the dash relay box. All right, so somebody's brakes just locked up. I don't know if you guys could hear that on the camera. I was just getting ready to talk and like I heard outside someone just lock their brakes up. Didn't hear a wreck though, so everything might be okay. For those of you who don't have access to like something like this, you know, wiring diagram stuff, I'm gonna try to show you best I can so you can find the placement of everything. So here's a kind of a diagram of your under the dash fuse and relay box. As you can see, we've got 1 through 11 on this bottom row. That's furthest away from like all the plugins. And then so we're in our second row. It's actually numbered on the fuse box itself under the dash. Like when you get under there, they put little numbers by each fuse, so it makes it really simple. But I'll just show you guys here. But we got 12, 13, 14, 15. So we're somewhat kind of in the middle of this second row in. Like I said, it's a 7.5 amp. I just tested mine with my voltmeter. I actually have 12 volts on that fuse. So what that means is, here's our fuse. I'm getting 12 volts to the fuse. So then somewhere between this wire that comes from this fuse got 12 volts somewhere between there and where it comes down, this black yellow, if you follow it, comes down to alternator. I'm losing voltage somewhere. Because if I have 12 volts in that fuse, I should have 12 volts to this all the way to here. I don't have 12 volts here, which means somewhere between where it goes in the alternator and where it comes out of this fuse box, it seems to be losing voltage. I don't know if I will try to trace down exactly where, or if I might just overlay this wire. And what that means is I'll find where this wire comes out of the fuse box, probably cut it, add my own wire, and run my own wire to the alternator, possibly. Unless I can just do a real quick look over and see if I can't find maybe a damage somewhere on this wire or something. But that's what I'm gonna look for next. I'm gonna try to figure out where this wire comes out of the fuse box, and we'll see where we go from there. All right, so basically I'm at this connector here on the strut, and I ohmed this black yellow wire. It's this one here. It would be this top left pin. I ohmed it from here to the black yellow wire on the alternator connector, and I had like a half a ohm, which is really good. But I ohmed it, the black yellow wire on this side, which is this top right one here. I ohmed it from there to the fuse, and I had like 1,000,000 ohms on it, which obviously is not good. So I've got either seems like I got a broken or shorted wire or something from this, somewhere from between this connector and the fuse box. So I'm gonna pull the fuse box out now, find the connector on the back side of it that's got this black yellow wire, and then basically I'll probably end up just overlaying the wire. I'll cut it at the connector at the fuse box, run my own wire up to here, and then connect it into this wire, so I can know I have a good connection from the fuse box to here, and hopefully that fixes our charging issue. All right, guys, so I've completed a little bit more testing, and I think I've got it figured out. Actually ended up being much simpler than I expected. I don't know what was going on with my voltmeter. I think it was kind of throwing me for a loop for some reason, because like I said, when I ohmed from the fuse to the connector on the strut, I got like 1,000,000 ohms. So I found the connector on the back of the fuse box that has the wire going out there to ohm from that connector to the connector on the strut, and only had like half of an ohm. So I thought, oh man, it must be in the fuse box where all that resistance is coming from. But then so when I pulled out the alternator fuse, it was blown, and I figured, oh, it must be that there's a bunch of resistance, and that's what blew the fuse. So that's why I was chasing down like a shorted or partially broken wire or something. Well, so after I ohmed that wire, and from the back of the connector on the back of the fuse box to the connector on the strut, I figured, you know what, before we go any further and I call the fuse box being bad, I'm going to throw a new fuse in it and see if it blows immediately or if it's good. So I threw a new fuse in it, and it didn't pop immediately. And I checked, I've got 12 volts on the fuse. I checked, I have 12 volts on the connector on the strut, and I got 12 volts all the way to the alternator now. So I think it was just a fuse. Why the fuse blew, I don't know. There could still be an underlying problem as to why it blew, but right now it's not blowing. So yeah, that's all. I guess that's all it really was just blown fuse, which would be like I'm sure I showed you earlier, but it's a 7.5 amp number 15, which is this one right here. Like I said, you probably can't see on the camera, but it is labeled. They do have the numbers labeled. So number 15, that's your alternator fuse. That ended up just blowing on me, seems like all the problem was. So I popped a new one in there. Like I said, it hasn't blown yet, so I don't know why it blew in the first place. Hopefully there's not any more issues. Hopefully it doesn't blow on him again. But if it does, I guess I'll have to do more digging as to what is causing it to pop. But for now, it seems to be working. So I guess I'm going to get this car thrown back together for him and get it back to him, and he'll have to drive it, and hopefully everything's good for him. All right, guys, so I just kind of want to throw out a couple other little pointers out there for other people trying to diagnose their alternator on their Integra. And maybe the fuse, like for me, was being the problem. That might not be your problem. You might have something else going on. So I just want to point out a couple other little things to help somebody diagnose other issues with their alternator. One of the first, most basic things, and I know this might sound kind of dumb to people, but I couldn't tell you how many people we've actually have had come to the shop and complain about like their power steering not working or their alternator not working or something, and literally their belt is just gone. So first things first, just make sure your belt is actually on and spinning your alternator, because that has happened before and people just don't realize it, that their belt like snapped off and it's gone on the road somewhere, and they had no idea. So make sure your belt's on. That's one. Make sure all your connections are tight. Like make sure your nut on your main wire on top of the alternator is tight. Make sure your battery connections are tight. On this particular car, I actually did notice his ground was loose. That ended up not fixing my issue. Obviously, it was the fuse, but I did tighten that up just to make sure. But you can have corrosion or loose connections, and that can cause a low or no charge issue. Make sure those are tightened up. Make sure the connections are clean. And then basically, like how I was testing before, is on your green plug-in on the, I know it's hard to see, but on your green plug-in on the alternator there, really your main concern is that black yellow wire. That's your ignition wire that tells the alternator to start charging. So obviously if you don't have battery voltage on that wire, your alternator is not going to charge. So make sure you have 12 volts on that black yellow wire. I know these things also have like a load detector on them where it can actually put the alternator in a low charge mode if it doesn't feel like it needs to charge a full 14 volts. But from what I understand, it'll charge at like 12 and a half. So just make sure that part of the if your alternator is charging at like 12 and a half volts, it may be because your electronic load detector is having an issue, so it's putting it in its low charge mode, which is only 12 and a half volts. So, and from what I understand, a way to test that is you can have somebody in the car and key on, put the throttle pedal all the way in. It should take it out of its low charge mode. If it doesn't, you have an issue. If it does, you're probably having a different issue. But if it stays stuck in that low charge mode, then you probably have a bad electronic load detector that may need replaced. So that's another thing to check out on these cars. But if you're not having a low charge mode issue, if you have 12 volts on your black yellow wire and all your connections are tight and clean, most likely, and your belt is on, most likely you just have a bad alternator. So hopefully that helps you all out diagnosing an alternator issue on your Integra. Like I said, there can be multiple different things. Mine just happened to be the fuse. Oh, that's another thing. Check your fuse. That might just be one of the first things you want to do. As if you check for power on your ignition wire, the black yellow wire, and you don't have 12 volts, go to your fuse next. Make sure your fuse isn't blown. Make sure you have 12 volts at your fuse. So yeah, hopefully that helps some people out with diagnosing their alternator on their Integra. This should be pretty similar for almost, there's probably a few differences, but pretty much all years of Integra, at least with the bug eye style, the 94 to 01 probably should be very similar. And then even LS, GS, RS, GSR, all those should also be very similar. Might be different wire colors for different years and between VTEC and non-VTEC, but it should be very, very similar, I assume. But yeah, that's going to be it. Hopefully this helps somebody, and hopefully we can get this car back to my buddy, and hopefully that fuse doesn't pop on us. Hopefully it was just a little fluke in the system that it blew, and there's not an underlying issue. If there is, then I'll probably get the car back, and we'll have to just dig in deeper as to why that fuse is blowing. But make sure you guys leave a like and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next video.